after this one, and we're starting to get towards the end of the course, and we're focusing in this block on how we can influence change. And in order to influence change, you need to understand where we currently are at. And this week in particular, we're looking at the debates between traditional educational models and emerging educational models and different pedagogical approaches. Because if you're going to try to change, particularly how teachers teach in an organization, you really need to have an in-depth understanding of why they teach in certain ways, and indeed what the advantages are to those different ways. Because while technology does afford certain new approaches to education, it doesn't necessarily mean that those new approaches are necessarily better. Okay, so before we get into the readings, are there any questions anyone would like to ask on any aspects that we've been covering so far in the course? You now should have all of your assessment for the first assignment completed. And now, of course, be starting to focus on the needs for the second assignment, your implementation strategy. And as you go over the next few weeks, you can also fill in the other aspect of assessment, the completion activities. I think that's what I call them. What did I refer to those as? Yes, completion activities. And indicate those additional things that you've been involved in. In particular, if you've been involved in these online discussions, that can certainly count. If not, there may be some other activities that you can get involved in and complete in order to meet that requirement. They're very easy marks. It's a nice, easy percentage to sort of add to your overall total, but you do have to do certain things to achieve that. Okay, so let's get into the readings. And the first one looks at the differences between what we call progressive education and traditional education. So let's share that with you. Okay. So Chandler explores the movement, particularly in the United States, around what's been defined as progressive schooling. It's a little bit more extreme than what we have had here in Australia. In particular, there was quite a lot of emphasis on discovery learning in the United States, which was an extreme form of progressive education, where students really were left to their own devices to come up with their own understanding of concepts, and teachers supported them in doing so. But in certain areas of learning, particularly in mathematics, it was proven to be quite unsuccessful an approach. I have tried it myself in the teaching of science. And again, while it is a very useful approach for teaching or to having students gain a really in-depth understanding of concepts, having them come to an understanding of first principles around various concepts on their own through various activities and supported processes, it is extremely time consuming, and there are other more efficient educational processes than discovery learning. So that can achieve also the same level of depth. But discovery learning is just at the extreme end of the spectrum of progressive schooling. So before I go into explaining that in any more detail, how about we hear from you guys? What is your understanding of progressive education? Or what's your understanding of traditional education? Who'd like to go first? Hutang, I know from your first assignment, you described the Iranian educational system as fairly traditional.
Yeah.
Have you got any examples of any progressive elements being introduced into the Iranian education system?
Unfortunately, Iranian educational system is completely traditional system, but I've just learned about progressive educational system here in this course, the first semester and this semester. So now I am familiar with both methods, and I know a little bit about it, but I cannot address it in Iranian educational system.
Now, I do understand. Stephanie, how about yourself? Have you had experiences of more progressive education approaches?
I guess at my ESL school, I guess it's technically called, we tend to not give the students lots of assessment and in traditional ways, I guess. We sort of, if one student has an assessment due, we give it to all of the students to sort of work through together. And then at the end, we just take the student's assessment who's due, rather than sort of giving them that assessment by themselves to sit by themselves and do it and then hand it back at the end. I don't know if that's really
Okay, well, that's an interesting approach.
an example.
It probably fits more within the traditional approach to education around assessment and so forth, but it's an interesting approach to use group support for students doing assessment tasks.
Yeah.
And Nav, how about you? Have you had any examples of progressive education?
Even in my hometown, they use most of the traditional systems.
Mm-hmm.
But in the competitive exams, they started using like the online test and the objective
Okay.
test.
So using those tools to assist in a traditional educational approach. Yep, understand?
Yeah.
Excuse me, may I say something?
Yes, you can.
In my my own pedagogy style, I can say that it's some kind of progressive style. That's I had some kind of problem in Iran because of my approach. That I try to, because in traditional style, in pedagogy we have to only represent what is already existed in the textbooks, and I had problem with this issue that we have to only represent and summarize what is already existed.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that in the future education, that we will have all the information accessible. We don't need to memorize the information, and we need to know how to use this information, how to apply the information instead of storing the information. So as a Persian literature teacher, I tried not to represent the memorizing information, but to make a conversation, make discussions, and ask my students to participate in discussions, and try and attempt to create a cognitive learning, profound learning, instead of just memorizing some special points.
Well, that sounds great. And welcome, Beth. We're just discussing the progressive education movement and giving some examples where people have moved from, or not moved, from traditional educational approaches to more progressive educational approaches. Do you have any examples from your own experiences?
Oh, hi. Sorry about the delay. Well, our school is going from that, or I've personally experienced that, going from more traditional approaches to learning to more progressive in just how I'm trying to implement technology in the classroom. So that's probably, mine's fairly personal, actually.
And how would you see that implementation being progressive?
Well, just from some of the reading, changing the ways that children learn, and changing the way that teachers teach, so the pedagogy behind what we do. So, yeah, quite a few ways, actually.
And welcome also to, I think it's Patricia. You've still got your son's identification. But that is Patricia, isn't it? Okay,
yeah, can you hear me? Sorry.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, it's me. Just got back from tutoring, so sorry.
No problems, just wanted to check who it was. Okay, let's go back to the readings then, and looking at the distinction between progressive and traditional education as defined by Chandler. So Chandler identifies some fairly extreme perspectives on education, but it's a good highlighting of those two main bodies of thought around the traditional approaches. Let me just get you to a bit of a summary. Okay, so traditional schools are epitomized by focus on academic standards, test taking, tracking students, grading, and grouping students by ability levels, and those sort of approaches. While more progressive schools are seen as being child-centered, democratic, an emphasis on projects, and looking after their emotional development and self-esteem, but also aspects around collaborative learning and cooperative learning approaches, and a move away from direct instruction and more didactic approaches. And they argue that this is more effective in developing higher order thinking skills and critical thinking, while advocates of more traditional approaches argue that their approaches are much more effective in developing what we frame as lower order thinking skills around development of knowledge and of understanding, and to a certain extent analysis of that knowledge and elements of that nature. So there really is quite a divide between the camps of traditional and progressive, and different studies come out every few years that advocate for one over the other. But there's also been a lot of unfair criticism of both sides. So let's have a look at a little bit of the table between the two. So traditional schools are described as being direct instruction by homogeneous groupings and reliance upon phonics, example, for reading, and direct instruction and drill and practice and computational skills in mathematics. Fairly regular testing against norm-referenced objectives, comparing students against their peers, and things of that nature. So it's what we would have seen in traditional education through the 18th or end of the 18th and into the 19th century and into the 20th century. But more so in the later parts of the 20th century, we saw a progressive education movement develop, focused around self-directed learning, in its extreme example around discovery learning, but in less extreme approaches around constructivist learning approaches, where students work cooperatively in various groupings. The whole language approach is sort of epitomized by the progressive movement, and student-initiated learning, which we, here in Australia, we're framing around, what's the current term? Inquiry learning. And these approaches have been sort of attributed to the progressive end of the scale, but also with portfolios, individual projects, and also collaborative projects. Not so much of an emphasis on grades, but more on a portfolio of student demonstration of their achievement, and very much around developing the student as a whole child, with the psychological, social, and cultural aspects incorporated. So you can have a look there at the differences on that sort of approach. And we'll go back now to hearing from you guys. Does any of that strike a chord, or you would disagree or have problems with either any of those elements being ascribed or subscribed to traditional education or progressive education? Any thoughts?
May I say something, please?
You may, Hutan.
I believe that, first of all, let me say that I just learned about progressive approach, and I really love it. But I think and I believe that progressive approach is coming to modify the traditional way, to traditional approach. So I believe that the theories of progressive approach, progressive education, are not established to implementation 100%. They came to modification the traditional style of education. At least I prefer this style to modify the traditional style by progressive approach.
Yes, and as Beth also indicated, that is the predominant approach teachers have taken, where they've taken a whole lot of elements from a traditional sort of educational perspective through to the more progressive educational perspectives, and mixed and matched their use of those different approaches in their own teaching and pedagogical practice. There are a few issues with that. It really is adopting quite different theoretical frameworks. So from a theorist perspective, it is problematic when some of these approaches do set up an entire belief system around how students learn, the very nature of learning, and the nature of teaching. But the reality is, for most teachers, they don't get involved that deeply in the philosophical debates around pedagogies, and simply take different approaches and provide a mix and range of different strategies for use in teaching. And that's certainly the approach we advocate in teacher education. Having an understanding of all these different approaches means you've got a whole tool bag of different approaches you can utilize when you engage with students. So one term, you may do a fantastic student-centered project-based learning activity. And the next term, you may have them focus in on doing a whole lot of guided instruction, with direct instruction, with PowerPoints and explanations, and have them develop some core knowledge. And that's really the approach I tend to advocate, in that, from my perspective, if you understand Bloom's taxonomy, where you've got knowledge and understanding and so forth down the bottom of the pyramid, and then analysis and creativity and so forth at the top of the pyramid, progressive approaches tend to be quite effective at the top end of the pyramid, the higher order thinking skills, while they don't necessarily work particularly well with the lower order thinking skills. While more traditional approaches are much more effective with the lower order thinking skills, but not necessarily as effective at the higher order thinking skills. And so a mix of approaches tends to be more effective than just one particular dogmatic approach. And that in particular is where things went wrong with discovery learning, where to be done at all, it really had to be at the extreme end, where you didn't do any direct instruction. And of course, that was quite problematic for students in engaging with the lower order thinking skills needed to support the higher order thinking approaches that were being advocated. Okay, so Okay. Who didn't believe women could reach the top end of the taxonomy? Oh, Bloom. Yes, well, it was quite a while ago, and certainly things have moved on in our understanding of those aspects. But that is a great segue into the next topic, which is another area of educational reform. Just getting onto it. Well, first, sorry, before we get to that, the other main advocate for progressive education, and indeed many consider him the initiator of progressive education, was John Dewey. And he was very much of the philosophy that education should be situated in the real world, where students should be doing real world activities, down to the level of running their own stores and farms and anything else that people did in the real world. He felt that students should also be doing, and that's where their learning should be based. Drawing from an apprenticeship model that was very common before we had formal schooling, where students learnt by hanging around adults and watching how adults did their everyday jobs, be that males or females or any aspect of society. We didn't have formal education. Students simply were taught as they needed to learn things, but most learning was done through modeling, where students observed and then practiced and played and learnt about how to do things through that process. Now, that has certain advantages, but it does have some disadvantages. And we've seen that in the debate between progressive and traditional. Project-based learning and so forth is fantastic at doing certain things and engaging students in particular, but there are some elements of learning which are quite complex in today's society, particularly around high levels of mathematics and things of that nature, where it's very difficult to just observe a mathematician do a whole lot of work and then learn mathematics from that process. You can do a bit of that by observing basic mathematics in terms of running a shop or doing some accounts or doing some taxes and stuff like that. But to really get into the deeper levels of mathematics, it's very hard to see that in a modeled way. But moving on from Dewey, there is a new area of learning and pedagogy, and that is around what we call cognitive science or cognitive pedagogies. And this is really drawing upon our understanding of psychology, and more and more as time goes by our understanding of brain science, where we're actually starting to learn how the brain physically changes in response to learning processes, and using that to inform educational practice. Now, it's still only fairly early days. Most of the initial work in this area was around psychological studies, because we really didn't have any understanding of the brain sort of 20 years ago. So it was very much based on psychology and doing experiments on children and on adults and seeing how they reacted to different things. And we got a lot of different understandings of behaviorism and other aspects from that. But more and more now, we're really understanding the processes involved in how memories are formed and how we retrieve memories, and we learn processes and we retrieve how to do processes and practice processes, and they reinforce the neural connections between brain cells. And at the moment, they're actually developing a computerized model of the human brain. And they believe that once that's fully developed, we're going to be able to actually try out in experimental ways a whole lot of approaches to learning on that computer brain and see how learning processes occur at a cellular level and gain a lot greater understanding of how to improve the educational process. Now, this isn't well done in schools yet, and it's not well done in teacher education either. We're still very much caught up in the traditional and progressive approaches, and between behaviorism and constructivism and more traditional direct instruction approaches. But it is starting to have a major impact in certain quarters, and it's certainly an area that I focus a lot of my research around, because I can see it being a major factor in influencing how we teach in the near future. All of our previous approaches have really been guesswork and trial and error. where we've tried things out and they've either worked or haven't worked without any real understanding of how, including all the stuff to do with blooms and constructivism and everything else. But cognitive science gives us a real chance to move similar to how medicine moved in the 18th century, where at the beginning of the 18th century, we were still attaching leeches to people and bleeding them and doing a whole lot of other stuff simply because we thought it worked in the past. We had no idea why it was working, but sometimes it worked in the past, so we kept trying it out. Very similar to how we do educational theory at the moment. But as we gained an understanding of how cells worked and how the body worked, we really changed very rapidly our understanding of medicine. And that's likely to happen in education as well. Okay, so there's a whole lot of stuff there that you can read about in terms of cognitive science theory and how that impacts upon education. But what are your thoughts? So Patricia, you've read a lot into this area when you were at ASU.
Yeah, it was really exciting. But like I said, it does seem to include things that good, if we can ever get to a definition of what a good teacher actually is. Yeah, you know, that you link the knowledge, you use scaffolding. You know what I mean, Jason? Like a lot of what we already do is included in what they're saying.
Absolutely. Of course, we've got some things right. Otherwise, education wouldn't have progressed. So a lot of things will be confirmed as being effective approaches, but we've never really been able to understand exactly why they've worked and to be able to then refine them in a scientific way. So knowing that scaffolding works and how it's actually changing certain aspects of the brain mean we can then refine the process of scaffolding far more accurately than we've been able to do in our previous approaches. But of course, we've tried many different approaches in education. Many haven't worked, but a lot have. And so it would be impossible for a lot of what we do not to be supported by our greater understanding that's emerging from brain sciences.
One of my lecturers was she was a young lady, but her doctorate was in psychology and in this field. She was very excited about the drugs that are coming in down the line to be very targeted towards, say, ASD and stuff. I myself find it very hard to get excited about drug therapy, however.
It is a very challenging aspect, and yes, I'm in the same boat, coming from a different age, but it is certainly the way things are going. And the whole evolution of smart drugs and drugs that to enhance learning, not just to correct difficulties that students have, but for normal students to use to improve their memory and to improve their processes of learning, are becoming very prevalent in society. And again, as we learn more about how the brain functions, hopefully those drugs will have less side effects and all these other aspects. But it goes beyond that into a whole lot of other areas of neural stimulation, where we actually apply electrodes at the moment, mostly to the surface of the brain, to stimulate various areas of the brain. But also there are experiments being done with deep stimulation, where we're actually inserting probes deep into the brain to stimulate areas. And that's starting to get rather complex as an educational process.
Yeah, well, because obviously we don't really understand how the brain completely works. So we're not, you know, I've got a wait and see approach. I'm quite excited by what I've read about it. But what the medication thing for me is most people look at medication, especially in schools and especially in special ed, because it's quite a sensitive area for us. So because some of our children have sometimes what seem to be fairly outrageous behaviours, not just ours, but there are kids. And so if a drug will calm them down, the school will typically put in measures to try to force the family to continue with that drug. I've seen it over and over and over. In 30 years, I see this repeated. And I keep saying to people, this is not about behaviour. The drug will not, you know what I mean? It's just frustrating for me.
It is, and there's a whole lot of societal issues around that.
Yeah.
The over-medication and particularly the ADHD epidemic that's been, to a large extent, fabricated is very problematic. But it goes well beyond just the profit aspects of drugging students. We're also normalizing students, and we're taking away the extremes. And those extremes, while in some cases they can be difficult to manage, also mean we could be losing a lot of our extremes in other areas, particularly in intellectual areas.
Yes.
You could certainly imagine that Einstein would have been medicated for his behavior and disobedience and so forth. So there's a lot of potential, particularly in the creative arts and other areas where students
absolutely.
So there's a lot of societal aspects that we're going to have to work through over the coming years. But it goes even beyond that, and then we start getting into gene therapies and genetic manipulation, which is also starting to emerge. And education is going to be an interesting area around these new technological developments. So in your implementation plans, hopefully you won't set in force a whole process of drugging all your students and genetically modifying them to improve their NAPLAN scores, but there will be things occurring in that space in education. And indeed, they already are happening, particularly in certain countries where they have less ethical restrictions on the experimentation. There's reports of widespread experimentations on genetic and drug enhancement of student intellectual abilities. So anyone else like to make a comment? We're getting into the sort of a rather extremes of educational technology here, but it is something that we do need to face in the near future, and indeed, particularly around the medication aspect, we are needing to face at the moment. Okay then, well, let's get into the final document. And this is quite a famous report now. So I'll bring it up for you. What makes great teaching? And this was a very extensive review of all the different approaches to teaching and what works and what doesn't work. Hattie cites this report quite a lot and makes quite a lot of ground out of it. But what I'll do is go to the summary. It's quite a long report. It goes in a lot of detail, but I've summarized the main aspects on your website. So here we are. Now, let's zoom in a bit. So the two factors that showed the strongest evidence of improving pupil achievement were teachers' content knowledge, including their ability to understand how students think about a subject and identify common misconceptions, and the quality of their instruction, which includes using strategies like effective questioning and the use of assessment effectively. So they were identified as the main aspects that were most important in student learning from all the different approaches that we know exist in education. They also identified some other good practices, challenging students to identify the reason why something is happening in a lesson. So improving their metacognitive understanding of the learning process. So getting them involved with understanding why you're doing something in a particular way as a teacher. Asking a large number of questions and checking the responses of all students. There's quite a number of studies that have been done showing how few certain students in a class get asked questions. And on average, most students only get asked 1 or 2 questions a day. And that's in reasonably good schools. The spacing out of study and practice on a given topic. So not just covering a topic once and then moving on, but covering it several times and repeating it with gaps between it. This fits in well with cognitive science theory, where it takes time for the neural pathways related to memory to form and to be layered down and reinforced. And just learning something once means it's almost certainly going to be forgotten, but it needs to be recalled and put into context several times before it's identified by the brain as something that is worth remembering and being reinforced in that process. And finally, making students take tests or generate answers even before they've been taught the material. So using pre-testing and allowing students to identify what they're going to be learning, so it sets in their minds the importance of certain aspects and gets their brain ready to take in those concepts and assigns that level of importance that means they'll be more likely to be remembered. And then there are a few practices that haven't been supported and indeed have been shown to possibly even provide negative aspects. Using praise lavishly. In particular, this has been a major criticism of the progressive approach in education, where students have been praised for everything and often given awards and trophies and gold stars for trying and for attendance and a whole lot of other things that weren't necessarily involved in any sort of achievement of or level of performance around their achievement. Now, this has been a problem because a lot of the emphasis of progressive education was on encouraging students and creating a positive environment for learning to take place. But it is seen as not having a major impact upon education. Teachers tended to have been a bit more hard-nosed about that because they were focused in the main around assessment that was driven beyond their control, while primary school teachers and lower secondary teachers tend to be more supportive of students and encouraging and engaging them in that way. Grouping students by ability was also seen as not having a significant impact. Allowing students to discover key ideas by themselves was certainly not seen as having a positive impact. That was the discovery learning approach. And the preferred learning styles aspect that was in the main misinterpreted from Howard Gardner's work is not being seen as having an improvement on student learning. So, what are your thoughts about those findings? How do they relate to your teaching experiences, if indeed they do? Okay, bye-bye, Nav.
Well, I'm happy to speak up if everybody else is happy for that to happen. This is one of the difficulties in special ed, I think. I've come from a mainstream background, so I've walked into special ed thinking, well, we're here to work and that's what we do. And this can be quite at odds with people who've been career SEP, perhaps, is one way to put it, because they can be a little bit more, he's showing up, he gets a smiley sticker. You know, that's great. Like, it's a different mindset, Jason. And so we still have teachers out there who have this paternalistic, and that's just not how special ed is anymore. We're all on about our students can achieve. You know, they don't just get a sticker for showing up at school. That's not how it is anymore. So that mindset, that lavish praise for really the kid not doing anything, just reinforces, I've got really low expectations for you of having any kind of success. So I'll just do whatever I can to give you a sticker. Do you know what I mean?
I do. And to a large extent, I agree with you. I do, though, take note of the extremes in the systems where we put too much pressure on students to achieve, particularly in some of our Asian countries where suicide rates related to school exams are extremely high. So there does need to be some moderation, but yes, we probably have, and the research has shown that we've gone too far in the supportive elements at the expense of not supporting students' self-worth around their own ability to achieve. So I think we can still be very supportive. It's just where we target that support and provide it in a way that recognizes achievement. It's also been one of the big areas we've identified in gender disparity, where girls are in the main praised for effort rather than achievement. And it's had quite a significant impact upon their perceptions of their ability to undertake certain subjects.
Yep. Yep.
Beth, you've put in a rather extensive comment. Would you like to explain it?
Sorry, just throwing down ideas as I'm listening to you. Yeah, we're actually just discussing maths groups at the moment, and we've been streaming for years, and we're now sort of looking at the idea of, is that necessary? Can we, and as we've been talking about, can we cover a number of topics over a period of time and revisit them? So there seems to be the research backing up the idea that maybe streaming is not such a good idea for the future. So yeah, it's interesting.
It is, and certainly in mathematics. Streaming has been very popular.
Yes.
Beth, I might just get you to mute your mic while you're not speaking. Just getting a fair bit of feedback there. And yes, there's a lot of arguments for and against streaming, particularly in mathematics where it's most prevalent. And a lot of it also has to do with the teachers involved in the teaching of mathematics and the hierarchies that establish within schools. Of course, it is nice to have a homogenous group where you only have to teach to a smaller demographic. But that does present a lot of impacts upon students that aren't necessarily selected for that top level group. Indeed, in a particular school on the Gold Coast where I once taught, I was involved in teaching of mathematics, and they had one particular group from the lower streaming class that was particularly disengaged, and so they decided to give them to myself. And generally, the lowest group was referred to as the veggie maths. And so when this separate group of about 8 students were identified as needing to be separated from that group, because essentially they hadn't opened their textbooks for the first 6 weeks of the school, they had to come up with a new name for themselves, and they decided to be called the compost maths. But we had a fantastic time. We taught in a very different approach, and by the end of it, all of them passed their exams and went on to have maths as their favourite subject. But that was because we had a very small group and we were able to use a whole lot of other approaches to achieve that. But it does indicate some of the problems with streaming. Students get certain preconceptions about their own ability level quite quickly in education. And it really is an important role of teachers to encourage students to think beyond those preconceptions and that they can achieve at a whole range of levels. Doesn't mean they can all be the very best mathematicians, but they can certainly all achieve the curriculum expectations of our school curriculum, which aren't that high. Be aiming to achieve those expectations. So it's an interesting area, and it's an area that is going to be controversial still, because traditional education does like the streaming approach, because things can be optimized for particular groups of students, and it does have some evidence in supporting test results for the very high achieving students, but it has other bigger disadvantages as well. So how about from others? Any other aspects of what we've identified as part of our current approaches to teaching?
Can I throw in 2 cents worth with the streaming thing? So there's
Absolutely.
professional me and parent me. Professional me says, I've taught in both settings, streaming and unstreamed. There is always variety. It doesn't matter. There is no such thing as a homogenous group. So parent me says, thank God my son at last got into maths extension, so he didn't have to do the 2 times table again when he was in grade 10. Like, that's what it is, Jason. The variety, it can be so huge, the variation in ability. I couldn't wait for him to get into some kind of extension program. And even amongst the extension kids, he was still top. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, and really that comes into the concepts of mastery learning and student progression. We do progress students based on their age rather than on their ability. And there's a lot of arguments that students should master their understanding before they progress on, because we simply set students up for failure if they are progressed without having achieved that mastery, and set teachers up for frustration where they've got to try to teach to the requirements of previous year levels when they should be focusing on the curriculum requirements at the year level that they have been assigned. But that's a structural reform required in schooling systems, and some schools are trying to, but it is very complex. But it's an area in particular that technology can assist with, particularly with self-paced learning and guided instruction, where we can set students to work on activities that are differentiated and that can be adjusted in terms of their ability, or adjusted in terms of the difficulty based upon their ability, and then continuously adjust and keep making it more difficult as students achieve mastery over concepts. So there's quite a range of different technology tools and approaches that are now being done to achieve that. Very few schools have undertaken it on a systemic approach just yet, but I know a number of them are looking at it, because it's one of the areas, particularly coming out of cognitive science, that is looking at potentially being a very significant change in terms of student learning outcomes at a systemic level of the whole school, rather than just the processes. And to a certain extent, streaming is one approach to addressing that issue. But it does have a lot of stigmas, but as do stigmas at being left behind. But if we can normalize that process, rather than students seeing progression as an automatic process based on their age, seeing progression based upon their ability, as they're quite used to in sport and in music and in a whole lot of other areas, but they don't necessarily see that in academics, because we've forced them to progress even when they haven't met the requirements of that progression. Any comments on that? Okay, I must have said something really controversial. Everyone's gone quiet.
Can I say something, please?
You may, Huten.
Again, I believe this is the same. I think these ideas are brilliant. To just consider them, that to modify the traditional way, and I believe they bring up new ideas that will create new education, which would not be as extreme as these theories. Do you know what I mean? I think the future educational system would be a modified method of these new theories. They are bringing them very, very good, very wise ideas that could not be implemented as extreme as the theories say.
No, Huten, you're quite correct. In the transition process, we will almost certainly have a whole mix of approaches used, and teachers will pick and choose, and different schools will pick and choose different approaches. The only caveat to that is that if brain science does fulfill on its promises of identifying very effective processes, we may then see a move to the learning science of education rather than a whole lot of learning theories. But that will take at least 10 years and probably a lot longer. But we are starting to see more research done in a systemic way, such as that report we just looked at, which is identifying practices that we know work and practices that we know don't work. And that's quite new to education. In the main, we've simply had teachers making choices from a whole range of things. More and more now, we're starting to identify things that have certainty in their approaches. Now, it doesn't mean that they will work effectively in all circumstances. There'll be certain systems and environments that decisions will still need to be made as to whether or not to employ them or not. And there'll be a progression of development. But next week, we're going to look at a whole range of emerging approaches to education. This week, our focus was, despite some of our dalliances into different approaches, has been on the traditional approaches to education and what we've currently been doing and have done in the past. And next week, we're going to look at where things could go with some of the more extreme approaches to educational reform. So, any final questions on things for tonight? You should all have your first assignment back and be now thinking about how to incorporate some of these new ideas into your implementation plans. But do we have any questions? Comments, statements? Thanks, Beth.
I'm just wondering about the next assignment. Do you have anything that you could put up, like even, I don't know what to write, I guess, in one way. I like a model, Jason. Have you got any models that I could see?
I think you're asking for like an exemplar.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, well, yeah, but not necessarily on this topic, but something similar.
I'll have a look. It's fairly complicated because I do change things every year.
Yeah, I know. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, how much theory do you want in this and that sort of thing.
Not a huge amount of theory.
Okay.
Certainly, it's good to support some of your major ideas with some aspects, but you should be able to draw upon your first assignment to provide some of that in terms of your justification for various approaches.
Yep.
It's very much more around a practical implementation plan where you've thought through all the different issues and you've developed a reasonably coherent approach to incorporating educational technology into your educational environment. So what I'd be looking for is, have you just chosen a few different technologies at random, or have you developed up a coherent progression of development? Is it likely to work? Have you put in place strategies to get stakeholder engagement and things of that nature? So have you considered those various elements? I've really given you a whole lot of dot points that you can just sort of fill out.
I'm just a bit worried that if my first assignment sucked, I've got nowhere to go, Jason.
I think you might be over worrying things. Have a look at your first assignment and that may alleviate your concerns.
Okay.
Okay then, any other questions before we finish up?
May I ask a question about
you may,
assignment? I was thinking about the second assignment, that we have to have a plan for 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years. I still think about that, 5 years and 10 years. Could those periods change to 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years?
Okay. What you're doing at that point is not creating scenarios like you did for the first assignment. Here you're describing what your preferred school system would be like in a year's time, or 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, as a result of your implementation plan. So if your implementation plan is put into place, what sort of changes should you expect to see immediately, in the short term, and in the long term? So that's really what you're being asked. You're not being asked to develop a detailed scenario, but what sort of changes would be expected to occur in your schooling or your educational space at your organization in those timeframes? So it's not, I don't think it's only 250 words to describe that, I think it is. So it's not going to be a huge amount of detail. Oh no, sorry, I've given you 600 words for that. So about 200 words for each. So, but imagine it if for your organization or for your country, if you're doing it for Iran, what would you expect to see change immediately with your implementation plan? What would occur over the next few years? What would change? And in the long term, what would you hope to see change?
Yeah, I understand, but 10 years is too long, I think, because we cannot have any imagination about the 10 years later, you know.
Okay, but you're not being asked to identify what the technologies might emerge in that 10 years and so forth. But say if you introduced constructivist learning into an Iranian school, what might happen immediately? Okay, there might be a whole lot of difficulties because everyone's learning a new system. In 5 years' time, students might be starting to come up with some projects and do some projects and learn some things around that process. And in the long term, there may be a change in the creativity being expressed by students, where they're starting to think about all of their subjects differently, having gone through a project-based learning approach. So that's the sort of thing that you're looking at having an impact upon. It's not so much impact upon the technologies involved in your organization, but your impact upon students and the organization as a whole. And for 10 years, that's students won't have even finished school if you're focusing on the younger students during that period of time. So if you implemented these changes in years 3 and 4, what sort of changes would be expected to be occurring in the system by the time they're finishing school?
This is a good idea. If I am managing, I'm thinking about a school as an educational system. So I can imagine that the first year students that would when they are finishing, when they will finish their school, what impacts that we expected to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And Patricia, yes, we may have to have a whole lot of ESL American courses for the refugees from America at that point.
Actually, I do have one little comment about the readings.
Yes.
Unless I missed it, there really wasn't much in there. You know, they talk about learning styles. There are also certain teachers, because you can only teach to suit your personality, Jason, and that doesn't seem to be in much research. Like teachers' own personality come into play.
Yeah. Now, well, there is actually quite a lot of research around that, but it's all under different terms, and a lot of it in psychology. Quite a lot around humor and the use of humor in schools, different authoritarian versus supportive roles. So there's a lot of research around teacher disposition. We do a lot about that around teacher identity formation in pre-service teacher education, where we get students to identify who they are as a person and then as a teacher, and their identity from the perspective of students and from staff and from principals and so forth. Of course, it is a very important thing for teachers to be aware of the perception that they present. And it can be quite different to different students as well. I was always known in schools I taught in as the teacher that all the nerdy kids related to. Of course, it was just my particular style and approaches and the project-based stuff I used to do and all that sort of elements. So there was a certain cohort of students that I had a great affinity to, but there were certainly others that I didn't have particular affinity to. And it was all to do with your teacher persona and identity and how you interact with others. So it is a very important aspect. I wouldn't associate it too closely with learning styles, which is a whole different approach.
No, but I'm just saying teacher personality themselves seems to be, you know, that how they teach. They choose from a range of strategies that sits comfortably with them, which disposition, which is what you were just saying, that's all.
No, absolutely. And yes, and the whole pedagogical approach, but also a lot of stuff I do in terms of research is around teachers' engagement with innovation and willingness to try new things and willingness to engage with new concepts and ideas. And that's very different with different personalities and different teachers as well. So there's a whole range of different aspects that, particularly as a school leader, you need to be quite aware of, because managing those and having a good mix of them in a school environment is very important. because you don't want everyone to be one particular type, because then you'd only be supporting certain aspects and certain students. So you need a good range, and good schooling systems and leaders ensure that that occurs.
Well, my approach is that, well, my belief, Jason, very good, grounded in empirical research, is that good teaching is a bit like magic. It's wonderful.
It is, but I'll put that down to us not really understanding the magic. And just as in medicine, a lot of medicine used to be magic. Now you probably wouldn't want to go to a doctor who was advocating that approach. I'm hopeful in 10 or 15 years we'll have the same in education, where we'll understand that magical process and be able to learn from it and replicate it much more commonly than those few teachers that have really struck the magical approach. But again, the magical approach does tend to only work with certain groups and certain particular groups of students as well, and subjects. What works for a fantastic English teacher certainly wouldn't work if they were teaching mathematics, and wouldn't work with certain students in a school environment. So
yeah, that's right.
Diversity is one of our strengths in education and in human society. And I think that's something we have to treasure.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, then we've gone a bit over time with those questions, so we'll finish up unless anyone's got anything burning to ask. Okay, then. See you next week.